What happens when one of America's most trusted news anchors comes face-to-face with one of the most controversial figures in modern royal history? The answer might surprise you, because what unfolded on NBC Nightly News wasn't just an interview. It was a masterclass in journalism that left viewers absolutely speechless. Before we get into this explosive exchange, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about celebrity interviews on major news programs. Because trust me, you're going to have opinions after watching this breakdown. The studio lights were blazing as Lester Holt sat across from Meghan Markle in what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. She was there to discuss her latest philanthropic venture, something about empowering women through digital literacy programs. Standard stuff, right? The kind of softball interview that usually gets scheduled during sweeps week to boost ratings. But within the first 60 seconds, it became crystal clear that Lester Holt had a very different agenda than what Meghan's publicist had probably promised her. Lester opened with what seemed like a friendly enough question. He leaned forward slightly, his expression warm but professional, and said, "Meghan, thank you for joining us tonight. You've spoken extensively about your commitment to truth and transparency. So I want to start by asking you about some specific claims you've made in previous interviews. Can you walk us through the timeline of when you say you were denied mental health support during your time in the royal family?" You could see Meghan's smile falter for just a fraction of a second. She recovered quickly, that practiced media training kicking in, and she replied, "Well, Lester, that was an incredibly difficult period in my life. I think what's important to understand is that the institution has very specific protocols, and when you're struggling, when you're literally asking for help, and you're told that it's not possible because of how it might look, that's devastating." Lester nodded, his pen tapping against his notepad. He wasn't writing anything down, though. He was thinking, and he said, "I want to make sure I understand correctly. You've stated in multiple forums that you approached human resources within the royal household. But according to documentation that's been made available through Freedom of Information requests in the UK, there's no record of any formal request for mental health services being filed by you or on your behalf during the period you specified. How do you reconcile those two things?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop about 10 degrees. Meghan shifted in her seat, and you could see her trying to calibrate her response. She said, "I think what you're not understanding, Lester, is that the institution doesn't operate the way a normal workplace does. There are conversations that happen that don't get documented. There are requests that are made verbally that never make it onto paper, because the whole point is to keep things quiet." "Fair enough," Lester responded, his tone still even and professional. "But you've also spoken about specific conversations with specific individuals. You mentioned speaking to the most senior person about your mental state. If we're talking about undocumented conversations, how do we verify what was actually said? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like we're being asked to take your word against an institution that, for better or worse, does keep quite extensive records of official interactions." Meghan's jaw tightened. This wasn't going the way she had anticipated. "Are you suggesting I'm lying about my own mental health crisis, Lester? Because I have to tell you, that's a pretty dangerous road to go down. Women, especially women of color, are constantly having their pain dismissed and their experiences questioned." Lester held up a hand, his voice remaining calm but firm. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking questions, which is my job. And I think it's important to note that asking for clarification or evidence isn't the same as dismissal. You've built a significant portion of your public platform on these allegations. People have formed very strong opinions. Families have been divided. Reputations have been damaged. So yes, I think it's reasonable to ask for specifics." The studio audience, if there had been one, would have been dead silent. But this was NBC Nightly News, so it was just the crew, and you could tell from the wide shots that even the camera operators were riveted. Meghan took a breath, clearly trying to regain control of the narrative. "Look, I shared my truth, my lived experience. I never claimed to have documentation. I shared what happened to me as I experienced it. If that makes people uncomfortable, maybe they should ask themselves why they're so invested in defending an institution, rather than listening to someone who was harmed by it." Lester leaned back in his chair. He wasn't backing down. "Here's what makes me uncomfortable, Meghan. In journalism, we have standards. When someone makes serious allegations, particularly allegations that damage reputations and have real-world consequences, we investigate. We corroborate. we look for supporting evidence. And what I'm struggling with here is that many of the specific claims you've made don't seem to hold up under scrutiny. The timeline doesn't match. The people you've named have provided different accounts. So help me understand, are we talking about differences in perception, or are we talking about something else entirely? Meghan's composure was cracking now. You could see the frustration building behind her eyes. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the kind of interrogation that women face when they dare to speak up about their experiences. You wouldn't be asking these questions if I were a man. Actually, Lester interjected smoothly, I would. In fact, I have. I've interviewed politicians who've been caught in lies. I've interviewed CEOs who've defrauded investors. I've interviewed criminals who've tried to manipulate their narratives. And in every single one of those cases, my job was the same. Ask questions, demand accountability, seek truth. Your gender doesn't give you immunity from basic journalistic standards. The exchange was heating up now, and Meghan seemed to realize she was losing ground. She tried a different tactic. Let me ask you something, Lester. Why are you so focused on picking apart my story? Why aren't you investigating the institution itself? Why aren't you asking about the documented racism, the documented history of covering up scandals, the way they've treated other women who've married into that family? Lester didn't miss a beat, because those other women aren't sitting in front of me right now making specific claims that can be fact-checked. You are, and part of investigating any institution is determining whether the allegations against it are credible. If your allegations don't hold up, that's relevant to the larger conversation. Meghan's media training was fighting against her genuine frustration now, and the frustration was winning. She said, I find it really interesting that you're more concerned with protecting the reputation of a centuries-old monarchy than you are with the well-being of someone who almost took her own life. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities. Lester's expression didn't change, but there was a sharpness in his voice now. My priority is the truth, Meghan, and I need to push back on what you just said because it's a manipulation tactic. I can care deeply about mental health, which I do, and also require evidence for serious allegations, which I also do. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. What you're doing right now is trying to make this about my character, instead of answering the questions I'm asking you. The silence that followed was heavy. Meghan looked down at her hands, then back up at Lester. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but there was an edge to it. You know what? I came here thinking I was going to have a conversation about the work I'm doing to help people. Instead, you've turned this into a trial where I'm the defendant. Lester nodded slowly, and I appreciate that you feel that way. But let me offer you a different perspective. You've spent years now building a brand based on being a victim of a powerful institution. You've done interviews, you've done documentaries, you've written books. You've made millions of dollars telling your version of events. So when you agree to come on a news program, not a talk show, not a friendly podcast, but NBC Nightly News, you have to expect that a journalist is going to examine those claims critically. That's not a trial. That's journalism. Meghan's publicist, who was standing just off camera, looked like she wanted to call the whole thing off. But Meghan pressed forward. So you don't believe me? Just say it. You think I made it all up? Lester shook his head. It's not about belief. It's about verification. I believe you experienced distress. I believe you felt isolated and struggled. What I'm questioning is the specific narrative framework you've built around that distress, the villains you've identified, the timeline you've presented, the institutional failures you've described. Those things can be investigated, and when they are investigated, inconsistencies emerge. That doesn't mean you didn't suffer. It means the story you're telling about why you suffered might not be accurate. That's semantics, Meghan shot back. You're splitting hairs to avoid admitting that maybe, just maybe, I'm telling the truth and the institution is lying. Lester picked up his notepad now, flipping through a few pages. Let's talk specifics then. You've claimed that there were concerns raised about how dark your son's skin might be. You've said this happened in multiple conversations, but you've refused to name who said it. You've given conflicting accounts about when it happened, and other members of your family have disputed that any such conversation occurred in the way you've described. Why should the audience believe your account over theirs? Meghan's eyes flashed. Because I was there. Because I lived it. Because I have no reason to lie about something so painful. But they were there too, Lester countered. And they say it didn't happen the way you're describing. So we have competing narratives. In journalism, when that happens, we look for corroboration. We look for patterns. We look for contemporaneous accounts. Do you have any of that? Meghan was visibly frustrated now. I have my husband. Harry was there. He heard it too. Lester tilted his head slightly. Harry has also given conflicting accounts about who said it and when it was said. In one interview, he seemed to suggest it was one person. In another, it seemed like it might have been someone else. His timeline has shifted, so even your corroborating witness isn't consistent. Do you see why that's problematic? What's problematic, Meghan said, her voice rising slightly, is that you're putting more energy into discrediting me than you are into holding a racist institution accountable. Lester set his notepad down. And there it is again. Every time I ask for evidence, you pivot to accusations of racism or sexism or institutional protection. Those are serious issues, Meghan. Real racism exists. Real sexism exists. Real institutional corruption exists. But that doesn't mean every allegation of those things is automatically true. And when people make allegations that turn out to be exaggerated or false, it actually makes it harder for real victims to be believed. Are you calling me a liar, Lester? Say it plainly. I'm calling you someone whose story has significant credibility issues, Lester replied. I'm calling you someone who has benefited enormously from public sympathy, while providing very little in the way of verifiable facts. I'm calling you someone who needs to be held to the same standard we hold everyone else who makes serious public allegations. Meghan stood up slightly in her chair, then seemed to think better of it and sat back down. This interview is over. Actually, Lester said calmly, you agreed to 30 minutes, and we're only at 18. But if you want to leave, that's your choice. Just know that walking out when questions get difficult doesn't help your credibility. Meghan looked directly into the camera now, bypassing Lester entirely. To anyone watching this who has ever been gaslit, who has ever been told their truth doesn't matter, who has ever been interrogated instead of supported, I see you. I stand with you. And I will not be silenced by people who are more interested in protecting power than protecting people, Lester let her finish. Then turned to the camera himself. And to anyone watching who believes in accountability, in evidence, in the importance of verifying claims before accepting them as fact, I see you too. These are complicated issues, and they deserve more than sound bites and emotional appeals. They deserve rigorous examination. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Meghan's publicist was now actively gesturing from off-camera, clearly signaling that this needed to end. But Lester had one more question. Before we wrap up, Meghan, I want to ask you something that I think gets to the heart of all of this. Do you think it's possible that your perception of what happened might differ from what actually happened? That maybe the reality was more complicated than the narrative you've constructed? Meghan's laugh was bitter. Of course, it's complicated. Life is complicated. But what's not complicated is when you ask for help and you're denied. What's not complicated is when you're treated differently because of your race. What's not complicated is when an institution protects its image at the expense of your mental health. But those are conclusions, Lester pressed. I'm asking about facts. Can you give me one verifiable fact, one piece of documentation, one contemporaneous account from someone other than your husband that supports any of the major allegations you've made? The silence stretched out. Meghan looked at him, then at the camera, then back at him. My lived experience is my evidence, she finally said. And that's the problem, Lester replied quietly. In journalism, in law, in any system that seeks to establish truth, lived experience is a starting point, not an ending point. It's something to be investigated and corroborated. It's not proof in and of itself. And until you can provide more than just your word against theirs, these questions are going to keep coming. Meghan's hands were gripping the armrests of her chair now, and you could see her trying to decide whether to fight back or shut down completely. She chose to fight. You know what I find really fascinating, Lester? You've spent this entire interview treating me like a suspect in a crime. But when you interview politicians who lie every single day, when you interview corporate executives who destroy lives for profit, somehow your tone is more respectful. Somehow they get the benefit of the doubt that I'm not getting. Why is that? Lester didn't hesitate. Because those politicians and executives don't base their entire public identity on being victims. They make policy claims, business claims, things that can be checked against voting records and financial statements. You've made emotional claims about personal experiences, and then you've used those claims to build a media empire while simultaneously demanding that no one question them. That's a different situation entirely. So I'm not allowed to profit from my pain. Is that what you're saying? You're allowed to do whatever you want, Lester said evenly. But when you monetize your pain on a global scale, when you sign multi-million-dollar deals based on your story, when you use your allegations to attack specific people and institutions, then yes, your claims become fair game for scrutiny. You can't have it both ways. You can't demand to be believed without question while also profiting massively from your narrative. Meghan's voice took on a trembling quality now, though whether it was genuine emotion or a calculated strategy was hard to tell. I shared my story because I thought it would help other people who were going through similar situations. I thought if I was brave enough to speak out, it might make a difference. And maybe it has, Lester acknowledged. But bravery without truth isn't bravery, it's something else. And helping people by giving them a false narrative about what happened to you doesn't actually help them. It might make them feel validated in the moment, but it's built on a foundation that doesn't hold up. You've already decided I'm guilty, Meghan said. You came into this interview with your mind made up. Actually, I came into this interview with questions, Lester corrected her. Questions based on inconsistencies in your public statements. Questions based on contradictory evidence. Questions based on the accounts of other people who were involved in the same situations you've described. If my mind seems made up to you, it's because your answers haven't addressed those questions. They've deflected them. Because your questions are designed to trap me, Meghan replied. Every single one is framed to make me look like I'm either lying or confused or exaggerating. There's no way to win with you. There's no winning or losing here, Lester said. There's just truth or lack thereof. And I'll be honest with you, Meghan, the more you avoid direct answers, the more you rely on emotional appeals and accusations of bias, the more you reinforce the concerns people have about your credibility. Meghan was shaking her head now. This is unbelievable. You've turned what was supposed to be an interview about my charitable work into an interrogation about my personal life. You're the one who made your personal life your public brand, Lester reminded her. Every initiative you launch is connected to your royal experience. Every speech you give references your suffering. Every interview you do circles back to the same allegations. You can't compartmentalize now and say that your charity work exists separately from your personal narrative. You've deliberately intertwined them. So what do you want from me, Lester? What would it take for you to believe me? Evidence, Lester said simply. Corroboration. Consistency. The same things I'd require from anyone making serious allegations. Show me the paper trail. Give me the names of people who can verify your account. Provide a timeline that doesn't shift depending on which interview you're giving. That's all. That's what journalism requires. And if I can't provide those things, if the evidence was destroyed or never existed because of how the institution operates, then you're asking people to take a leap of faith, Lester said. And that's fine for personal relationships, for religious beliefs, for matters of opinion. But when you're accusing specific people of specific actions that have specific consequences, faith isn't enough. You need proof. My proof is my life, Meghan insisted. My proof is what I went through. My proof is the trauma that I'm still dealing with. Trauma is real, Lester agreed. No one is disputing that you experience trauma. But trauma doesn't automatically validate every claim you make about the source of that trauma. People can be genuinely hurt and still be wrong about who hurt them or how they were hurt. Perception isn't always reality. So you're saying I imagined it all? That I made up the racism and the isolation and the institutional cruelty. I'm saying that your emotional experience of events and the factual reality of those events might not be the same thing, Lester clarified. I'm saying that feeling abandoned and actually being abandoned are two different things. I'm saying that interpreting something as racist and something actually being racist are two different things. Context matters. Intent matters. And without the ability to examine those things objectively, we're just accepting one person's subjective interpretation as absolute truth. Meghan was quiet for a moment. And when she spoke again, her voice was cold. You know what, Lester? I think this interview says more about you than it does about me. I think it reveals exactly what happens when someone dares to challenge power. When someone dares to speak truth to an institution that has spent centuries protecting itself, they get torn down, they get questioned, they get treated like criminals. And people like you enable that. People like me seek truth, Lester responded. And if that's threatening to you, if basic questions about consistency and evidence feel like attacks, then maybe you should ask yourself why that is. Maybe you should ask yourself whether your narrative can actually withstand scrutiny or whether it only works when people aren't allowed to question it. The interview was clearly reaching its conclusion now. Meghan's body language had shifted from defensive to dismissive. She looked at her watch, then at Lester. "I think we're done here." "One last thing," Lester said. "You've built a following of people who believe in you, who support you, who have defended you against criticism. Don't you think you owe them the truth? Not your truth, not your lived experience, but the actual verifiable truth about what happened. Don't you think they deserve better than to have their loyalty based on a story that might not be accurate?" "I have told them the truth," Meghan said firmly. "Just because you don't believe it doesn't make it false, and just because you believe it doesn't make it true," Lester countered. "That's the fundamental issue here. You want your word to be enough. You want your feelings to be proof. You want your narrative to be unquestionable. But that's not how reality works. That's not how journalism works. That's not how justice works. Then, I guess we'll have to agree to disagree," Meghan said, standing up now and removing her microphone. "But for the record, this isn't a disagreement about opinions. This is a disagreement about standards. You want to be believed without being questioned. I believe that everyone, regardless of who they are or what they've been through, should be held to the same standard of evidence and accountability. That's not personal. That's principle." Meghan didn't respond. She simply walked off the set, her heels clicking against the studio floor, her publicist rushing to follow her. Lester turned back to the camera, his expression unreadable. "What you just witnessed was an exchange that I think captures something important about our current moment," he said directly to the viewers. "We're living in a time where personal narrative is often treated as sacred, where questioning someone's story is seen as attacking them personally. But journalism can't function that way. Democracy can't function that way. Truth matters. Evidence matters. And holding powerful people accountable, even when they present themselves as victims, especially when they present themselves as victims, is essential. These are uncomfortable conversations, but they're necessary ones." The camera held on Lester for a few more seconds before cutting away, leaving viewers with the image of a journalist who had just refused to back down from one of the most media-savvy figures of our time. That exchange on NBC Nightly News became an instant cultural flashpoint, dividing audiences between those who felt Lester had finally asked the questions everyone was thinking and those who believed he had subjected Meghan to unfair treatment. But regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, one thing was undeniable. Lester Holt had demonstrated exactly what happens when careful preparation meets careful questioning. When a journalist refuses to be swayed by emotion or manipulation, and when the pursuit of truth takes precedence over the comfort of the powerful dot. So what do you think? Did Lester cross a line, or did he do exactly what a journalist should do? Make sure you subscribe to this channel and drop a comment below telling me whether you think tough questioning of public figures is necessary, journalism, or unfair targeting. I want to hear your perspective on this because this conversation is far from over.